David, it seems to me the basic contention in your book is that we're all getting taken by corporations, and the government's pretty much letting them get away with it.
Yes.
People often say to reporters like you and I that, oh, well, these are the worst case examples. It's really not as bad as you describe. But I bet there's probably more examples. Did you have trouble filling this book?
No, I have enough material. I could do another book and maybe 2 more books.
On this very same theme, right?
On the same theme about what's going on. And unfortunately, we need to keep in mind what Adam Smith taught when he wrote The Wealth of Nations in 1776. Seldom do businessmen gather together even for merriment, but the talk turns to a conversation against the public interest to raise prices and lower wages. And what I document in the fine print is how a number of big corporations have tried to thwart the rigors of market competition, create monopolies and duopolies and oligopolies, artificially raise prices, provide very poor service compared to in some industries, other countries of the world, and in a few cases literally put lives at risk, and how we don't have a balanced system focused on competitive markets.
Now, we'll go through some of these specific examples, and I think everybody that talks to you probably has their favorites that jumped out at them. But to you, what was the most egregious? What stands out to you as being the most egregious, and tell us a little bit about it?
Well, I think the single most egregious story in the book is about a man named Bob Manning. Bob Manning was a 26-year-old lineman for the electric power company in upstate New York, Niagara Mohawk. And one day in February of 1962, as he was coming down off a power pole, a bolt of electricity got loose and he went headfirst into the pavement, paralyzed from the neck down. And I met Bob in 1997 when he called the New York Times looking for help because he couldn't collect his workers' compensation benefits 35 years later. But that's not the really egregious story I tell in this book. The really egregious story is that the power company was sold. The insurance company that had his claim, which was owned by a bunch of utilities, was then sold, and they had a finding that there were no cases of refusal to pay benefits. The New York State Insurance Department. I actually called them about that, and I said, did you not read the front page of the New York Times? Did you not read what Governor Pataki said? And they went, well, we don't pay any attention to what's in the newspapers. And I said, well, what about all the complaints by this man? And they said, yeah, but he never got a final judicial ruling that they'd refuse to pay him. So they gave him a walk after refusing all these years to pay. They did ultimately pay some of the money he was owed. And then the insurance policy was bought by Colin Ree, a Warren Buffett company. And a nurse comes around, ingratiating herself into Bob Manning's life in Sacramento, California, where he had moved. And eventually she goes to his home, which they have a right to do, to inspect. And the Mannings are these wonderful people who they adopted 3 children from a relative where the parents were killed. And they're these marvelous human beings. One of the sons grew up to become an airline pilot. And this nurse goes into Bob's room and points to the wall and says, why don't you have a DNR? A DNR means do not resuscitate. Why are you having the medics try to keep you alive when you have one of your medical emergencies, which happens all the time to people in this condition? In effect, asking him to die. And, Bob's wife, Bob, his nurse, his doctor, all the people who saw the nurse do this and her other actions were just appalled by this. Well, Warren Buffett didn't know about this and wouldn't approve of it in the least. On the other hand, what does Mr. Buffett say about his companies? So long as my managers make their numbers, I let them run the businesses as they see fit. And it's indicative of the callousness that's going on where we don't have balance and we're so focused on profits that you literally can have a company go and say, please die.
But when we talk about it in your book, you talk a lot about some of these industries have been deregulated, and often, certainly in this presidential campaign, people think about regulation in terms of a Democrat versus Republican issue. But were more of these laws, were more of the problems created because of Democrats or because of Republicans, or is this not a party-related issue?
This is not a partisan issue. There's one party in Washington. It's the party of money. There's one party in the state capitals. It's the party of money. And frankly, if you or I were elected to Congress, we'd have to behave like every member of Congress does, because if we want to get reelected, which means we have to listen to the people who are going to provide the money to pay for the campaigns for us to run for office. And it's not going to be Joe Sixpack and Mary Smith. It's going to be representatives of big corporations and wealthy individuals who all come pleading, I just need a little change here that'll be fair. What they really want to do is unlevel the playing field and thwart the rigors of the market. And by the way, there's no such thing as deregulation. There is only re-regulation. There's only new regulations. So what we've done is taken regulations. I'm not going to defend every regulation, but we took a regulatory scheme that was balanced, that looked at the interests of companies and looked at the interests of customers and other parties, and replaced it with a system of the corporations by the corporations that takes away consumer rights. Everything is regulated. You know, I like to say baseball regulates right down to how many stitches are on the ball and what color the yarn is. Everything is regulated. And most of the regulations that are in the Federal Code of Regulations in the state, they were sought by corporations. Business seeks regulation both to define the playing field, but more importantly, to try and prevent competitors and escape the rigors of competitive markets.
Mm-hmm. Often writing the regulations.
In many cases, regulations and statutes are actually written by the companies. That's right.
That's always interesting to see, and people would never believe that, but it happens all the time.
But you, having worked in Washington many years, you've seen it. Well, everybody who works near the sausage factory has seen that that's what happens.
And the advocacy groups do it too. Everyone's in on it. You know, they're all drafting.
It is, although the advocacy groups have a lot less power and influence than the corporations.
Mm-hmm. Certainly, less money. So you refer in a couple of the powerful phrases in the book to me where you refer to ours being a rigged economy.
Yes.
You've kind of touched on that, but if you could explain a little more clearly.
Well, in a competitive market, government would set the rules and, as the Germans do with what they call ordoliberalism, adjust the rules as businesses figure out how to game those rules to try and have as level a playing field as possible. You're not going to have perfection, but you want to keep trying to make sure the playing field is level, because the market will figure out best how to allocate capital and who should succeed. But it's also a natural tendency in a capitalist market to head toward monopoly or duopoly, where a couple of very successful firms keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and removing competition. And when that happens, what you get is stultification. You know, once you're a monopoly or a duopoly, you don't want to invest in innovation. You don't want to take risks. You just want to mine the market. You want to do what economists call rent seeking, by which they mean earning profits greater than you would get in a market economy. When you add to that all of these rules and regulations that in the book, and every chapter, I'm sure you read things you have not read in the news media.
No.
Yes. I show how again and again and again the market is being rigged. This is terrible for our national economy in the long run. It helps explain why we're in these economic doldrums and why we don't have the job creation we should be having.
So let's go through some of the examples. You know, maybe we'll touch on a few of my favorites, and then get back to some of the ones you might have stood out more for you, other than that awful story about Bob Mann that I'll never forget as long as I live. How about the internet? The fact that do I have this right? So we have the highest prices in the world, and we're 29th in speed and. Explain how did that come to be?
We invented the internet in America. Right? It was taxpayers who paid to invent it. It was set up by academics and the military through what's now called DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. And so we began at number one. And back in the 90s, Al Gore, as a senator and vice president and others, promoted this idea that we would have this wondrous thing called the internet. And when browsers came along in 1995, it meant that geeks weren't the only people who could use it. You can have what we all know today as the internet. The telephone companies and the cable companies all went to Capitol Hill and the state legislatures and said, we're going to build this fabulous thing. And there was this great television ad that ran in 1999 that I tell about, where an old geezer, sort of like me but thin, pulls into this Fleabag motel, drops his satchel, says to the young woman behind the desk, rooms, king-size beds. Room service, coffee and donuts in the lobby. Entertainment, she looks at him and says, every movie ever made in every language, in every room.
Yes.
That's what we were promised. Yeah. And this was shot at Roy's Cafe and Motel in the Mojave Desert. Right. Well, the rest of the world is doing that. The internet is being made universal in all these other places. America ranks 29th now in the speed of its internet, behind such leading industrial lights of the world as Moldavia and Ukraine. Moldova and Ukraine. We pay the highest prices in the world by far. By one measure, we pay 38 times what the Japanese pay per bit of information. If you buy one of these triple play packages, and I have one in my home,
me too.
You pay on average with taxes in the U.S. $160. In France, you pay $38 U.S., and you get worldwide calling to 70 countries, not just the US and Canada. You get worldwide television, not just domestic, and you're